Okay, welcome, students of the words course of SDSU Spring 2025. I realized that I was going to change these words here, English words, to actually say the name of the course, which is just such an incredibly generic name. I think English roots from Greek and Latin. Anyhow, that is the course. If that's why you're here, you're in the right place. And I'm excited to begin kind of our official journey of learning. Hopefully, you've already seen the video introducing the course, and this is the first video kind of getting into the material of the course. But this lecture and the two lectures that follow it are going to be focused on the introduction, the very first chapter of our book. So it's actually going to be a very unique lecture in which we talk a little bit more about theory and history than actual words. So if you're watching this and you see maps and historical dates and you start to panic, like I'm not in a history course, don't worry. We're just going to kind of get this out of the way just to have some context for what we're doing and for what English is coming from. I think for some of us, this is going to be very interesting. And for some of us, it's just going to seem like superfluous information. And some of us will fall in the middle. But I think it's interesting. So, and it hopefully be short. Like my whole goal for these lectures is just short little lectures to kind of give you some background, give you some context for the things that you're studying on your own. So that is where we're going if I can do it correctly. There we go. So here's our learning objectives. In the entire first week of lectures, not only this lecture, but the two that follow it, these are going to be our learning objectives. So we're going to learn how the history of English is also the history of conquest and assimilation. There's a really interesting connection. Many of you may know this from different classes already between language and really colonialism, if we're being honest with each other, but also the history of English in particular is such an interesting kind of epic saga of power. And so, yeah, so we're going to briefly go over that. We will to become familiar with the evolution of English from Beowulf to Arcane. I'm recording this in December of 2024, and I'm trying desperately to finish watching Arcane because my nephew, who's your age, is very excited about it. But when I say arcane, I mean the English of today, right? And Beowulf. So what I'm saying, we're going to become familiar with Old English, which is the language of Beowulf. We're going to touch briefly on Middle English, and then we will of course be focusing on Modern English in this entire class. We're going to talk about the spread of Proto-Indo-European, which is amazing. I think if you're not familiar with it, I think you will be very impressed by the magnitude of Proto-Indo-European. And then just because this is something I'm fascinating in, I have a very brief little excursus about Linear B. So that's kind of what we're doing in this first series of lectures. So, where did English come from? So, for many of us, I know I had this assumption that English was just the language spoken in England, ye old England, right? And then it just kind of spread everywhere through the dominance of England in the medieval and Renaissance eras. That was kind of my assumption, and the fact that England and English are the same word, essentially, it would really encourage that. And here is a picture of Stonehenge, which is in England. So, yeah, so that's what you might think, but I'm here to tell you no. So let's look at that. Actually, it didn't originate in England at all. It came from outside. So here is our history of England in particular. So I'm going to be using these BCE. I'm going to be using that as kind of our timeline marker. BCE stands for Before Common Era. You may also know this, and you're absolutely welcome to use the term BC, which basically stands for Before Christ, right? It's the exact same time period. BCE is just a little more academic. So BCE stands for Before Common Era, and so the time moves backwards. So like 1000 is 1000 away from year zero, right? Or year one. So prior to 1000 BCE, which would be considered kind of the Dark Ages, if we were studying Greek history, we actually have no idea who lived in the area we call England now, or what language they spoke, because they didn't leave any sort of writing that we can find and interpret. Around 1000 BCE, the Celts arrived. Now, the Celts are they're a fascinating group of folks. And I know that some of you were in my mythology class last semester, and we were talking about the Celts. And the Celts are just this like amorphous group of wandering peoples who actually originated very far east. We're thinking like Germany, that part of the world, and they came west. And they ultimately, around 1000 BCE, the Celts arrived in what we call England now, and they were not speaking English. They did not speak English at all. They spoke Celtish, which we, again, don't have very much evidence of because they were not writers. They did not write things down. So we just speculate that they had this kind of language, Celtish. That particular language, Celtish, split into two different dialects. Gaelic, which is today even now spoken in Ireland and Scotland, and Britannic, which you can find spoken in Wales. So these are two dialects of Celtish. Neither of these are English. They're still living languages, they're still being spoken, but they're not English. So just as an interesting couple side notes. And then in 55 BCE, so a full almost 1,000 years later, Julius Caesar invades England. He brings Julius Caesar. I know many of us know who he is. He's a truly an epic man of history, and he brought Roman troops all the way north to England. And it's a really fascinating story that I can't talk about it because these are supposed to be short lectures, but he ultimately lands in England and he brought Latin with him, including, and this is important, this will be important to know the name Britannia. Britannia, Britain, these are not native English words. This is actually a Latin word. So Julius came, but then, because he had an exciting life, just a few years later, he fell into a bunch of difficulties. And so, just to kind of show, and this is the sort of thing we are actually going to be focusing on much more of the class, the interesting way certain words come into English from various other languages. The word Rubicon is actually a Latin word. It's the name of a river. And so after Caesar went to England, he came back to Rome and he actually invaded Rome. And there was this great symbolic moment where he crossed the Rubicon. And by crossing this river, the Rubicon River, which was essentially like a symbolic border for Rome, he declared war on Rome. And then this became a metaphor. Crossing the Rubicon is a metaphor for the point of no return. And but then of course it's become so common that we now have the Rubicon Deli, which is a delightful, delicious deli. There's one in Mission Hills. I think there's one over in La Jolla. So I would try it. Anyhow, so Caesar dies, and then there's just chaos in Rome for a long time, and it's about 100 years later, 43 CE. So CE stands for Common Era, which is also known by many of us as AD. So this Emperor Claudius becomes emperor of Rome, and he is the first Roman to really officially go back to England, and he does so and he conquers Britain essentially and makes it a Roman provincia. Now, our book, for whatever reason, loves the word provincia, so you can read a little bit about this word. It's basically the word province. But yeah, so Britain becomes basically just yeah, like a Roman province, a Roman state, really. And when that happens, the Celtic languages become subordinated to Latin. This is what Rome does. It does it all over the place. It goes to different places and it conquers them and it makes Latin the language of the law. And so that's actually, I know many of us are in this class because we still have so many Latin phrases in legal terminology. And so this is something we actually share in common with the peoples of the Roman Empire, which is this weird foreign language describing legal points. And so this is what happened in Great Britain. England, people were still speaking native dialects, but Latin became kind of, if you will, the lingua franca, the language of the ruling classes. And then, of course, Christianity came not too long after Claudius, just a couple, maybe 100 years later, a couple hundred years later. Um, Christianity became the official kind of religion of the Roman Empire, and the people who were running the church would speak Latin. So we see this intermixing, but still no English. So eventually, the Roman Empire fell. Notoriously, it took a very, very long time for it to fall. So it was very much the bureaucracy was propping up Rome for a very long time, and that included the bureaucracy in Great Britain. But eventually, the Romans withdrew from Britain, and Britain basically fell to a handful of competing kings. And that will, so basically we see a language vacuum, if you will. So around 449 BCE, CE, 449 CE, AD, if you will, the situation here in England was so bad. There was just so much chaos, so many roving bands of brigands, if you will, that one British king hired German tribes to come into Britain and protect the people. And so here we see the Isle of Britain. And so what this king did is he went to the tribes here, which is like, I don't know what is that, Norway. So that's the sort of area. And here, so the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons. So the Jutes we never talk about, right? Like they're lost to history, but we do retain our familiarity with Angles and Saxons with the phrase Anglo-Saxon, which you see all the time as an adjective. Here we go, Anglo-Saxon, describing various aspects of the world. So, but these originally were just tribes of Germans, Jutes, Angles, and Saxons. They were all speaking a different language, but similar language. So those tribes come in and they basically, actually, let me go back. So they come in from here and they settle in this part of England. So the Angles settle here, the Saxons settle here, and the Jutes, it doesn't really matter. They kind of do their own thing. And they basically just start kind of taking over, not in a really hostile way, but they just sort of start kind of living there. And the people who live there start speaking the same language, which spoiler alert, is English. And also just to go back one more time, this was in 449 CE. So they lived there for approximately 400 years when in the late 800 CE, a king named Alfred the Great, who is a descendant of the original Angles, becomes king. And under Alfred the Great, those disparate little units were kind of unified. Alfred the Great is essentially the first kind of king of England. So he becomes the king of the land of Angles. And when he does that, that kind of marks the point at which English is identified and recognized as the primary spoken language of Great Britain. The word English itself comes from the Anglo-Saxon word English. So basically is the same exact word. And most importantly, literature began to be written in English. And that's just, and we're going to be seeing that consistently throughout the course. People speak different languages all the time. It's not until language starts being written and used by the powerful classes that it's able to kind of spread and become powerful. And we're going to see that consistently over and over again. And so at this point, because people started writing in English, that's what kind of guaranteed its success, especially over languages like Gaelic or Britannic, which were still spoken, but they never became like the languages of the ruling people. So as I say here, the literature of the Angles was written, and then one thing led to another until here we are. So that is my hopefully brief introduction. I hope that I have piqued your interest and you will come back for the next lecture when we will talk actually about Old English and Middle English, etc. So I'm going to pause here and I hope to see you again soon. Oh, I always forget how to do this. Okay, thank you.